Okay, so we're still in the Amarna period under Akhenaton, which was definitely a totally different style in still under the New Kingdom, but just the Amarna style um, under the rule of Akhenaton, who kind of changed religion. He changed the style, um, and the style of art became more curvilinear lines, more kind of effeminate features, and just actually a lot more affection and emotion is shown in some of these relief sculptures that we're going to look at. So this is a relief stele that provides a rare look into the relationships in the royal family. And the style is similar to the sculpture of Akhenaton that we looked at earlier. There's a lot of undulating curves. It's not as stiff and formal as the old or Middle Kingdom figures that we've seen. And they both have this protruding belly, which is a style that kind of came in during this time. And then there's the sun disk here. So the rays of Atan are coming down on the family, the royal family here. And we can see that there's a lot more affection and emotion shown. You know, one daughter is reaching up to touch Nefertiti's face. She's, gently holding her child in her lap. He's kissing his child here. So that is totally different than what we've seen in earlier Egyptian art here. The fact that they're showing this intimate portrait of the royal family. It's a definitely radical upheaval from previous art that we've seen. And this is considered a sunken relief because it's a technique that is made by chiseling deep outlines below a stone's surface, instead of cutting back stone around a figure to make them project from the surface. So they're just keeping the rock more flat and just carving directly into it, just lines, a little bit of curves, but not going super deep. And it doesn't project as much from the surface, which means it's less likely to break over the years. And I think that's why they think that they use this technique, is because it just lasts longer. So Post-Marna Period began after the death of Akhenaton, and Egypt just returned back to the old religion. So the most famous pharaoh from this time is definitely Tutankhamun, who was probably Akhenaton's son by a minor wife. And he ruled for around a decade, but he died at the age of 18, so he was actually put in charge when he was just 8 years old. And they tried to investigate the mummy for signs of murder, but that was ruled out in 2005. So he's very famous today, but in the relative scheme of things, he was actually a relatively unimportant pharaoh. But the reason that he's so famous is because his tomb was discovered in 1922 by a British archaeologist, and his grave had not been looted. So there was a lot of really rich treasure still intact, and that's why he's so famous. It's just happened to be that he was so lucky that his tomb did not get raided. So he's very famous, even though in life he really wasn't a very important pharaoh. So this is the innermost coffin of Tutankhamun, and his tomb is at Thebes. It's 18th dynasty, 1323 BCE, and it's made of gold inlaid with enamel and different semi-precious stones, and it's about 6 feet 1 inches long. And this is definitely the most important item in the burial chamber or the tomb. And the royal mummy was actually encased in 3 different coffins, one nested inside of each or inside of the other. And the innermost coffin was made of beaten gold, which is about a quarter ton of it. So, and it's inlaid with different lapis lazuli, different kinds of stones. So, very rich piece. This is the death mask of Tutankhamun from the innermost coffin. And it's 18th dynasty, obviously. It's a portrait mask. So it's inlaid with semi-precious stones made out of gold. And it's kind of a sensitive portrait of the boy king. And the richness found within his tomb is definitely a testimony to Egyptian wealth and pride and power. take another look at some other things found in Tutankhamen's tomb that maybe you haven't seen before. This is a painted chest, and it's made of wood. It's about 1 foot 8 inches long, and it suggests that Tutankhamen fought several wars. It shows him commanding an army, and this might have just been because Egypt had a lot of traditions that required kings to be these great warlords, and so that might be why they're just depicting him as this victorious general. But the lid panel shows him as a successful hunter, and then he appears larger than the other figures, so hierarchy of scale is being used to show his importance. And then he rides a war chariot on this side and draws his bow against his enemies. And then on one side, he's actually battling the Asians, and then on the other side, he's battling Africans. So these themes are very traditional. We've seen them before. War scenes, hunting scenes, banquet scenes are very common. But it's a little bit more curvilinear, the style of it. The lines are very curvy. And so that's showing, some influence from that Amarna style, sorry. Kind of saying that wrong, but okay, so we'll move on to the next slide here. So the first millennium BCE, during this time, Egypt lost a lot of its power. The fertile lands and great wealth made it a big target to other foreign powers, and the Egyptian empire kind of dwindled away. And in the 4th century BCE, Alexander the Great, who was a Greek, he actually came, and then after him, Rome took over. So they eventually kind of replaced the Egyptian pharaohs as the rulers of Egypt. And so there was a kingdom that did take over at a point in time, and it's called the Kingdom of Kush. And they ended up ruling Egypt for a time, and it was Egypt's gold-rich neighbor to the south, the Kingdom of Kush, which is actually in modern day, I believe, Sudan. And it's referred to as Nubia, which means gold in Egyptian. And in the 8th century, the Nubians rose up and conquered Egypt, and they established themselves as the 25th dynasty. And so they did rule, and they called themselves the 25th dynasty. And so we can see one of their rulers here, Taharko, pictured as a sphinx from the Temple T at Kawa, Sudan. And around 680 BCE, this Kushite pharaoh, Takaro, constructed a temple at Kawa. And this portrait was found in it, and it depicts him as a sphinx. He's wearing that traditional headdress with the cobras. His name is actually inscribed on the chest. But you can see his features are distinctly African. He looks a little more African, they think. So it's not supposed to be a record of his ethnicity, but it does have some of his features recorded. So it's not a true portrait, but we can see that he looks to be more African. So eventually the Kushites fall to the Assyrians, who sacked Thebes in 660 BCE. And so at this time, Mentemhet was the mayor of the city and was quite powerful, and he was also a priest of Ammon. And according to the records, he was responsible for restoring the temples that the Assyrians had razed. And he has numerous, sculptures of himself in the temples that he restored throughout Thebes. So this is definitely a portrait statue of Mentemhet from Karnak, Egypt, 26th dynasty. It's made of granite. It's 4 feet 5 inches high. So it kind of combines that realistic face with the idealized body, which might show a combination of strength and wisdom. And he has his left foot forward, which is a convention we've seen. He's very rigid. He's still attached to the rock, so it's not technically totally in the round. His left foot is forward, and he's slightly under life size, and is quite large and heavy. And he wears a Middle Kingdom kilt and a New Kingdom wig. So it's kind of an eclectic style that is very common during the later period of Egyptian art. It just becomes more eclectic. There's just more of a mixture of different styles going on. And he does have that immovable presence, which is appropriate because it's meant to be a timeless image of the deceased. So after Alexander the Great, the Greek, um, we've seen a lot of artistic conventions. Once started, they had very long lives, which is crazy to think about, that they were able to keep things consistent over a period of 25 to 3,000 years. So even under Alexander the Great, the Greek, the culture of Egypt remained, somewhat the same. They had the same conventions. They were still doing a lot of the same things. This temple of Horus in Edfu, Egypt, is kind of a testimony to that. It's a pylon temple with a great entrance and a massive facade. So you can see the facade or facade, however you want to say that, here. And it's got those characteristic sloping slides. And then they have the huge sunken reliefs. And they celebrate King Ptolemy, who was the brother and husband to Egypt's last queen, Cleopatra. But Cleopatra ended up outliving her husband by more than 2 decades, and also was one of most famous female pharaohs from Egypt as well, besides Hatshepsut. So on the temple facade, you can see Horus and Hathor witnessing a giant Ptolemy the Eighth smiting his enemies. So he's bashing in his enemies' brains, which has been a convention we've seen a lot when pharaohs are shown doing that, because they're supposed to be great military leaders to keep Egyptian society stable and to keep the chaos of the outside world at bay. And it's a common pictorial theme used since pre-dynastic times. So it's just this temple is definitely a testimony to the enduring nature of Egyptian pictorial types. Even under Greek rule, which was when this was built, those conventions are still being used. So, and that pretty much wraps up the lecture. I don't think we have any more slides. So, yeah. So we will see you in the next lecture videos.